Get your hands off the desk. The sharp voice cut through the stale air of the small, fluorescent-lit office, making her flinch. She froze, her fingers hovering just above the desk, her grip tightening around the neatly stacked papers she had brought. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't move. Not yet. I said, step away. The officer's voice grew louder, harsher, filled with authority and impatience. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. The intensity in his stare wasn't just firm, it was dismissive, hostile, and unapologetic. He wasn't looking at a person. He was looking at something less than that. I'm just trying to, don't talk back to me, he barked, his words like gunshots echoing off the walls. Before she could say another word, the scalding splash came out of nowhere. A full cup of steaming hot tea flew from his hand, hitting her directly in the face. The heat was instant and searing, burning her skin as it dripped down her neck and soaked her carefully chosen blouse. The papers she'd held fell to the floor, scattering across the room as her hands instinctively flew to her face. Gasps caught in her throat as the sting set in, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. The officer didn't move to help. He didn't apologize. Instead, he leaned back with a smug expression, crossing his arms over his chest like he'd just proven a point. That should teach you some respect, he said coldly, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in satisfaction. Her breathing quickened. The burning sensation throbbed against her skin, but it was nothing compared to the wave of humiliation crashing through her body. She felt the eyes of others on her, the officers in the hallway peeking through the glass windows, their gazes quickly shifting away as if they hadn't seen anything. No one stepped in. No one said a word. And he knew it. The officer smirked again, stepping closer this time. You think you can just walk in here and start throwing around attitude? Is that it? His voice dripped with condescension, each word sharp and deliberate. Not on my watch. For a moment, the humiliation threatened to drown her, but she swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep standing. Her blouse clung to her body, still wet, but she didn't flinch. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. He raised an eyebrow. What? Nothing to say now. Her jaw clenched. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight back. She wanted to demand that he explain himself, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she took a deep breath and carefully reached down, gathering the scattered papers one by one, never breaking eye contact with him. You don't belong here, he spat, his voice low but heavy with meaning. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She gripped the papers tightly, the edges crumpling slightly under the pressure of her fingers. She didn't say a word. Because she knew something he didn't. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why she was there. And he definitely didn't know what was about to happen next. He thought she was just another woman walking into the station, another face he could intimidate, dismiss, and humiliate. But what he didn't know was that the woman he just assaulted, the woman he just humiliated in front of everyone, wasn't there to file a complaint. She wasn't there to ask for help. She was there to take control. She was the new chief of police. The officer, still unaware of the gravity of his actions, turned his back, completely certain he had won. But she wasn't leaving defeated. As she walked out of the office, the echoes of her heels striking the linoleum floors rang out like gunshots, sharp, steady, unbroken. The burn on her skin was nothing compared to the fire burning inside her now. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because the papers in her hand weren't just papers, they were orders, instructions, and decisions that had the power to change everything. By the end of this day, the man who thought he could humiliate her would come face to face with the truth. But the real question is, what happens when a man like that, drunk on power and protected by a broken system, refuses to let go of his authority? How far will he go to keep his secrets buried? And how much damage will be done before the truth finally comes out? This isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about justice. And no one, not even him, sees it coming. Hello, and welcome to Plow of Twist. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say something important. Here, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and any form of injustice. We believe in equality, respect, and the power of change. To our Black viewers, your voice matters, your life matters, and your story matters. This channel is a space for impactful narratives that challenge injustice and inspire transformation. Thank you for being here with us today. Now, get ready for an emotional and powerful story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a twist. Enjoy the story. The air in the police station was heavy, thick with the faint scent of stale coffee and cleaning supplies. The hum of printers and the occasional ring of a desk phone filled the background, blending into the steady shuffle of papers and low murmurs of conversation. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stretch, where minutes felt like hours, and the walls, lined with faded photographs of past chiefs and worn-out plaques, seemed to absorb every word spoken, every secret exchanged. Seated behind a wide, scratched desk was Officer Darren Walker. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a jawline that always seemed locked in place. His uniform, though perfectly pressed, couldn't hide the weight he carried, not physical weight, but something heavier. Years of authority, of making decisions and not being questioned, had built a confidence in him that bordered on arrogance. His blue eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned the room like a predator surveying its territory. He was proud of his record. 14 years in the force. Commendations for bravery. A spotless reputation, or so it seemed. Darren had made it clear early in his career that he didn't take orders from anyone he didn't respect. And to him, respect wasn't freely given, it was earned. That belief had made him popular with some and feared by others. But underneath it all, there was something darker. It wasn't just the uniform or the badge that gave Darren his authority. It was the way he carried himself, the way he looked at people who didn't fit his image of who belonged there. And in his eyes, Danielle Brooks didn't belong there. Danielle had walked through the front doors of the station that morning with her head held high, but every step had been deliberate, calculated. Her heels clicked softly against the tile floor, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that turned heads without needing to demand attention. She was striking, tall, with smooth, dark skin and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see through the noise. Her tailored blazer and pencil skirt spoke of professionalism, but there was something more, something unspoken that lingered in the way she looked at the officers around her. She was used to walking into rooms and feeling the weight of people's stares. Growing up in Detroit, Danielle had learned early what it meant to stand out, and not always in ways that felt empowering. She had fought for every bit of respect she'd earned, every degree, every promotion. Nothing had been handed to her, and she wore that struggle like armor. She wasn't the kind of person who crumbled under pressure. She'd built herself up too carefully, too intentionally, to let someone else tear her down. But standing in that station, she could feel it, the unspoken tension that came with being a Black woman in a place like this. Darren noticed her the moment she stepped inside. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he didn't have to. He'd seen women like her before, women who walked in with their heads high, expecting to be treated like equals. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching her as she approached the desk. "Can I help you?" His voice was flat, mechanical, but his eyes said more than his words. Danielle set her papers down carefully. "I'm here to, you need to step back," Darren interrupted, his tone hardening. She blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You can't just walk up to the desk like that," he snapped. "You need to wait your turn." Danielle opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, he was already standing. His chair scraped against the floor as he loomed over her. "I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't how things work here." Danielle's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I just need to speak with someone about don't talk back to me," he interrupted again. The tension in the room shifted. A few officers nearby glanced over, but no one said anything. Danielle's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. Then it happened. Without warning, Darren reached for his cup, steam still rising from the top, and flung the hot liquid toward her. Danielle barely had time to react. The scalding tea splashed across her face and neck, burning her skin and soaking into her blouse. She gasped, stepping back as the heat spread, but Darren didn't flinch. He smirked. "That should teach you some respect," he said, his voice low and sharp. For the first time, Danielle's composure cracked. She clutched the edge of the desk to steady herself, her breathing shallow, her skin stinging. The room was silent. But Darren didn't care. He didn't see the fire in her eyes. He didn't see the storm building behind her silence. Because Darren Walker thought he had one. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Danielle Brooks wasn't there to be disrespected. She wasn't there to ask for permission or plead for fairness. She was there to take control. And Darren Walker was about to learn what happens when you push the wrong person too far. The papers scattered on the floor weren't random documents. They were orders. Decisions. Danielle didn't walk out of that station defeated. She walked out with purpose. Because by the end of the day, Darren Walker's smirk would be gone. The question wasn't whether Danielle Brooks would rise. The question was how far Darren Walker would fall. The office door creaked as it closed, sealing Danielle Brooks inside her new space. She stood motionless for a moment, her hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. The sting on her face had dulled, but the memory of the hot tea splashing against her skin lingered like a fresh wound, as raw and burning as the humiliation she had swallowed. The room was bare, too bare. There were no photos on the desk, no degrees mounted on the walls, no personal touches to soften the cold, sterile space. It wasn't because Danielle lacked accomplishments. Her resume could have filled the walls twice over. No, the emptiness was intentional. She hadn't come here to decorate an office. She had come to clean house. But as she stared at the blank walls and the pile of reports stacked haphazardly on the desk, a weight settled over her. This wasn't going to be easy. She had known that the moment she took the job, but knowing it and feeling it were two very different things. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, forcing her voice to stay steady. Detective Marcus Reed stepped inside, shutting the door behind him as though he didn't want anyone to overhear. He was younger than Darren Walker but carried the same hardened look, a look born from too many late nights, too many unsolved cases, and too few wins. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and there were faint circles under his eyes. "I heard about what happened," Marcus said, his voice low. Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Did you?" Marcus hesitated. "Look, Darren, he's out of control," Danielle finished for him. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "He's been here a long time. People trust him." "Trust?" Danielle asked sharply. "Or fear?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the papers scattered across her desk. It was the look of someone who had seen too much but wasn't sure how much of it he was ready to admit. "Is this what I can expect from the rest of your team?" Danielle asked, folding her arms across her chest. "No," Marcus said quickly, but there was hesitation in his voice. "Not everyone." Danielle's gaze didn't waver. "But enough of them?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "Darren has connections. Friends in the department. He's been around a long time, and people look out for him." Danielle stepped closer. "And what about you? Are you one of them?" Marcus hesitated again before finally shaking his head. "I'm not one of them. But that doesn't mean I can make this easy for you." Danielle studied him for a moment before nodding. "I don't expect easy, Marcus. I expect results. Marcus gave a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then you're in the right place. Just be ready, Darren's not the type to back down. Danielle didn't need the warning. She already knew that Darren Walker wasn't going to make this easy. She'd seen it in his eyes that morning, in the way he had smiled after throwing boiling tea in her face and then dared her to say something about it. But Darren didn't know who he was dealing with. Not yet. Danielle didn't have to wait long to see the cracks in the foundation of the station. Over the next few days, she sat through meetings where officers avoided eye contact with her, whispered in corners, and made it clear they weren't ready to trust, or respect, her authority. And Darren? Darren made sure his defiance was as public as possible. He interrupted her during briefings. He questioned her decisions in front of the team. He smirked every time she walked by, as though daring her to challenge him. But Danielle didn't flinch. Instead, she watched. She listened. She read every file she could get her hands on, and slowly, she started to see the patterns. There were complaints against Darren that had been buried, complaints of excessive force, intimidation, and questionable arrests. Cases had been closed quickly, victims had gone silent, and officers had been transferred out with little explanation. The more Danielle looked, the clearer it became that Darren wasn't just a bully. He was a man who had built his power on fear, and he was determined to keep it. Late one night, long after most of the station had emptied, Danielle found Marcus still at his desk. His tie was gone, his sleeves rolled up, and his eyes were bloodshot from staring at the screen for too long. "You're still here," Danielle said, stepping inside. Marcus didn't look up. "Couldn't sleep." Danielle set a folder down in front of him. "Take a look at this." Marcus opened the folder and flipped through the pages. As he read, his expression darkened. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight. "I started digging," Danielle said. "And this is just the beginning." Marcus closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "You realize what you're doing, right? If you go after Darren, you're not just going after him. You're going after everyone who's been protecting him." Danielle didn't hesitate. "Good. They should be scared too." Marcus studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I'm in." Danielle left the station that night knowing she had at least one ally, but it wasn't enough to shake the feeling that Darren was already onto her. The way he watched her. The way he whispered to others. Darren wasn't just a man with power, he was a man with secrets. And secrets like that didn't stay buried forever. By the end of the week, the tension in the station was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officers whispered in corners, conversations stopped when Danielle walked by, and Darren's confidence seemed to grow with every passing day. But Danielle wasn't intimidated. Because she was holding on to something Darren didn't know, a file filled with names, dates, and evidence that pointed to a truth he'd spent years trying to hide. And Darren Walker had no idea how close she was to exposing it all. But the real question wasn't whether Danielle would bring him down. The question was how far Darren would go to stop her before she could. Danielle stood just outside the door to the interrogation room, her hand resting lightly on the handle. The dim hallway buzzed faintly with the sound of fluorescent lights overhead, the hum vibrating through her chest. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained steady, controlled. She took in a slow breath, letting it settle deep before exhaling. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The moment he never saw coming. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her heels tapping against the tiled floor. The room was colder than she expected, the kind of chill that didn't just settle on your skin but sank into your bones. Darren sat across the table, leaning back in his chair like he didn't have a care in the world. His arms were crossed, his legs stretched out, and his smirk was already in place. "So," he said, his voice low and sharp. "Is this the part where you try to scare me?" Danielle didn't answer right away. She let the door click shut behind her, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the small space. She moved deliberately, taking her time as she set the folder she carried down on the table. Then she sat, her eyes never leaving his. "No," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "This is the part where you start to realize how much trouble you're in." Darren's smirk didn't falter, but something in his eyes shifted, just for a second. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Danielle caught it. A flicker of doubt. A crack in the wall he had built around himself. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You think you've got something on me?" Danielle didn't blink. Instead, she opened the folder and pulled out the first sheet of paper. She slid it across the table, letting it sit there in front of him. Darren's eyes dropped to it, and for the first time, his smirk began to fade. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "You tell me," Danielle said, leaning back slightly in her chair. The paper in front of him wasn't just a complaint. It was the first of many, a documented pattern of excessive force, intimidation, and tampered evidence. She watched as Darren scanned the page, his jaw tightening, his fingers twitching slightly before he shoved the paper back across the table. "This is nothing," he said, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. Danielle leaned forward again, her eyes locking onto his. "You sure about that? Because it looks like a lot more than nothing to me." Darren's voice dropped lower, rougher. "You don't know what you're talking about." Danielle slid another paper toward him. Then another. And another. He barely glanced at them before shoving them aside. "I've already sent copies to Internal Affairs," Danielle said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "They'll be here in the morning to start the investigation." Darren's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood abruptly, towering over her. "You think you can come in here and tear this place apart? You think you can do this to me?" Danielle rose slowly, her movements deliberate, measured. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. Instead, she met his glare head-on. "No, Darren. You did this to yourself." For the first time, the confidence in Darren's eyes wavered. He glanced at the papers scattered on the table, his breathing heavier now, his shoulders rising and falling with each breath. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice quieter but no less dangerous. Danielle didn't back down. "No," she said firmly. "I'm fixing one." Darren's jaw tightened, but before he could speak again, the door opened, and Marcus stepped inside. "We're ready," Marcus said, his voice steady. Darren's eyes flicked to Marcus, then back to Danielle. "You think this is over?" Danielle's gaze didn't waver. "I think it's just getting started." Marcus stepped closer. "Let's go, Walker." Darren hesitated, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. But then he stepped back, letting Marcus take him by the arm and lead him out of the room. The door closed behind them, leaving Danielle alone. She sank back into the chair, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered the papers back into the folder. The room felt smaller now, heavier, like it was holding on to the tension that had filled it just moments ago. When she stepped back out into the hallway, the station was alive again. Phones rang, officers moved between desks, and conversations buzzed in low tones. But there was an undercurrent to it all, an awareness. People were watching her now. Marcus met her near his desk, his expression tense but determined. "It's done," he said. Danielle nodded, her voice steady. "Not yet. But it will be." Marcus hesitated, then motioned for her to follow him. He led her to his desk and pulled up a file on his computer. "You need to see this," he said quietly. Danielle leaned in, her eyes scanning the screen. It didn't take long for her stomach to sink. "This isn't just Darren," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Danielle's eyes narrowed as the pieces started to fall into place. Names. Dates. Connections she hadn't seen before. "How deep does this go?" she asked, her voice sharp. Marcus hesitated. Deeper than we thought. Danielle straightened, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. Darren Walker wasn't the end of this. He was just the beginning. And as Danielle looked out over the station, at the officers whispering in corners and stealing glances in her direction, she knew one thing for certain: this fight was far from over. Darren had been bold, but whoever had been covering for him was smarter. More careful. And they wouldn't go down without a fight. But neither would she. Because Danielle Brooks wasn't just here to clean up the mess Darren had left behind. She was here to burn it all down if she had to. And whoever was still pulling the strings? They were about to learn that she wasn't afraid to cut them. Danielle stood at the edge of the station floor, her hands gripping the edges of the folder so tightly that her nails threatened to tear through the paper. She watched as Darren was led out of the building, his shoulders stiff, his head held high like he was walking to a podium instead of to the back seat of a patrol car. The officers around them whispered, but no one dared to meet her eyes. Marcus stepped up beside her, his voice low. He didn't say a word on the way out. Danielle didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on Darren as the patrol car door slammed shut. He doesn't need to. Not yet. Marcus hesitated. He's going to fight this. You know that, right? He's not just going to sit back and let this happen. Danielle finally turned to face him, her voice sharp. I'm counting on it. Marcus blinked, but before he could respond, an officer hurried up to them, clutching a tablet. You need to see this, the officer said, breathless. We just got an anonymous tip. A video. Danielle took the tablet, her pulse quickening. She hit play, and the screen lit up with grainy footage, security camera footage from inside the station. Her stomach turned as the video showed Darren in a darkened hallway, speaking to another officer, Officer Brent. Brent's voice came through first. They're asking too many questions. She's not letting this go. Darren's voice followed, low and sharp. Then we make sure she doesn't get the answers. The footage cut out abruptly, but Danielle felt the weight of it like a punch to the chest. Marcus leaned closer. How the hell did we miss this? We didn't, Danielle said quietly. Someone's been helping him. Someone who knows how to cover their tracks. Marcus cursed under his breath. Brent. Danielle nodded. He's not the only one. There's more to this. Before Marcus could respond, the station doors swung open, and Brent himself walked in. His eyes scanned the room before locking onto Danielle. He hesitated, but then his face hardened, and he strode toward her. Chief, Brent said, his tone carefully measured. Can I speak with you privately? Danielle stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. She glanced at Marcus, who stepped slightly closer, his presence solid at her side. Anything you have to say, you can say here, Danielle replied, her voice steady. Brent's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. I don't think that's a good idea. Why not? Danielle challenged. Brent's eyes flickered to Marcus. Because this is bigger than you think. Danielle's breath caught, but she didn't let it show. Then you'd better start talking. Brent hesitated, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Look, I didn't sign up for this. Darren, he's not the only one. There are others. People who've been covering for him, protecting him. It goes higher than you think. Danielle's stomach churned, but she kept her voice calm. How high? Brent swallowed. Command. Maybe higher. Marcus stepped forward. You knew, and you didn't say anything. Brent's face hardened. You think it's that easy? You think I didn't want to? But you don't understand what these people can do. Danielle's voice cut through the tension. We're not afraid of them. Brent's laugh was sharp, bitter. Then you're not as smart as I thought you were. Danielle took a step closer, her voice low but steady. No. I'm just not as scared as you. Brent's eyes flickered, but before he could respond, the doors to the station burst open again. This time, it wasn't officers who entered. It was internal affairs. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman in a dark suit, walked straight to Danielle. "We're taking over," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Danielle's jaw clenched. "I hope you're ready for what you're about to find." The investigator didn't blink. "So do I." As internal affairs spread out through the station, Danielle stepped back, her heart pounding. Brent stood frozen, his face pale, but Darren's words echoed in her head. "Then we make sure she doesn't get the answers." Marcus leaned in, his voice low. "This isn't over." Danielle shook her head. "Not even close." She turned back to Brent, her eyes locking onto his. "You said this goes higher," she said. "How high?" Brent hesitated. "You're not going to like the answer." "Try me." Brent swallowed hard. "The chief before you." Danielle's blood ran cold. "What about him?" Brent's voice dropped lower. "He was in on it. All of it. He let Darren cover it up. He helped him." Marcus swore under his breath, but Danielle didn't flinch. "And you?" she asked. Brent's shoulders sagged. "I didn't stop it. I didn't say anything. But I didn't. I didn't do what he did." Danielle's voice was sharp. "You stood by and let it happen." Brent flinched but didn't argue. Danielle took a step closer. "You want to make this right? Then start talking. Everything you know. Right now." Brent hesitated, but then his shoulders slumped, and he nodded. As he started speaking, Marcus typed furiously, taking notes. Danielle listened, her stomach twisting with every new revelation. By the time Brent finished, the room felt heavier. Danielle turned to Marcus. "We need to move fast." Marcus nodded. "What about him?" He nodded toward Brent. Danielle's voice was cold. "Keep him here. We're not done with him yet." As she walked out of the room, the station was buzzing with movement. Internal Affairs was tearing through files, questioning officers, and sealing off offices. The walls of the station seemed to hum with tension, but Danielle didn't slow down. Because she wasn't done yet. And neither was Darren. The hum of voices filled the station, but Danielle barely heard them. She moved through the chaos with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the tile as officers scrambled to clear desks and retrieve files. Internal Affairs had spread out, taking statements, cataloging evidence, and sealing boxes of documents. The air was thick, heavy with tension and the scent of burnt coffee that lingered from abandoned mugs. Brent sat slumped in a chair at Marcus's desk, his hands nervously wringing each other as he stared at the floor. He had already spilled more than she expected, but Danielle knew there was more, there was always more. She leaned against the edge of Marcus's desk, her arms crossed, watching Brent closely. "Let's go over it again," she said. Brent looked up, his eyes bloodshot and tired. "I already told you everything I know." "No," Danielle said firmly. "You told me what you thought was enough to save yourself. Now tell me the rest." Brent hesitated, his gaze darting toward Marcus, then back to her. "I didn't have a choice." Danielle's voice was cold. "Everyone has a choice." Brent leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You don't get it. Darren wasn't working alone. It wasn't just him and the chief before you. There were others, higher-ups, people you don't even know about." Danielle's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. "Names." Brent hesitated. "I don't know all of them. I swear. But there were whispers, connections to city officials, judges, even someone in the mayor's office." Marcus cursed under his breath, but Danielle stayed focused. "You're telling me this goes beyond this station?" Brent nodded. Way beyond. Darren handled the dirty work, but he wasn't the one pulling the strings. He was just doing what they told him. Danielle stepped closer. And what about you? What were you doing? Brent's shoulders slumped further. Keeping my head down. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. That's not good enough, Danielle snapped. Brent's eyes flickered with anger. You think I liked it? You think I wanted to watch Darren get away with it over and over again? I didn't have a choice. If I spoke up, I'd lose everything, my job, my family, my pension. You don't know what it's like to feel trapped like that. Danielle's voice cut through the room. No, Brent. You don't know what it's like to stand up and fight when you're scared. But you're about to find out. Brent swallowed hard, looking away. Marcus stepped in. So what now? We've got enough to bring Darren down, but if Brent's telling the truth, he's just the tip of the iceberg. Danielle's mind raced. She had expected pushback, expected resistance, but this was bigger than she'd prepared for. The corruption didn't end with Darren. It ran deeper, spreading out like roots through the system, tangling itself into places she hadn't even touched yet. We keep digging, she said finally. We follow the threads and see where they lead. Marcus hesitated. And what if it leads to people we can't touch? Danielle's eyes hardened. Then we cut deeper. Before anyone could respond, one of the internal affairs officers approached. Chief Brooks, he said, holding up a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a flash drive. You're going to want to see this. Danielle took the bag, her fingers brushing against the cold plastic. What's on it? We're not sure yet, the officer said. It was hidden in Darren's desk, inside a locked drawer. But whatever's on it, he didn't want anyone finding it. Danielle's pulse quickened. Get it to the tech team. I want answers by the end of the day. The officer nodded and hurried away, leaving Danielle staring at the flash drive. Marcus leaned closer. What do you think's on it? Danielle didn't take her eyes off the bag. Proof. One way or another. Marcus exhaled. If it's what we think it is, this could blow everything wide open. Danielle nodded, but her mind was already racing. If the flash drive held evidence, real evidence, it could take down more than just Darren. It could expose everyone involved. But it could also put a target on her back. Hours passed as the tech team worked. Danielle paced her office, her phone vibrating with updates and questions, but her focus stayed on the screen in front of her. She barely noticed the sun setting outside the window, the orange glow fading into darkness. Finally, Marcus stepped into her office, his face pale. You need to see this, he said quietly. Danielle followed him to the tech room, where a monitor displayed a series of folders and files recovered from the flash drive. Videos, documents, bank transfers, evidence tying Darren and several other officers to illegal activities ranging from drug trafficking to extortion. But one video caught Danielle's eye. She clicked on it, and the screen flickered to life. Darren's face filled the frame. He was sitting in a dimly lit room, speaking directly to the camera. If you're watching this, Darren said, then things didn't go as planned. Danielle's breath caught. This isn't just about me, Darren continued. This is bigger than me, bigger than this station. I did what I had to do, but I wasn't the one pulling the strings. And if you're looking for someone to blame, you'd better be ready to look higher. The video ended abruptly, leaving the room in silence. Marcus turned to Danielle. He knew this was coming. Danielle's jaw tightened. And he made sure we wouldn't stop here. Marcus nodded. So what's the next move? Danielle stared at the screen, the weight of the evidence pressing down on her. She knew what this meant. Taking down Darren was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead, and the people she was about to go after wouldn't go quietly. She turned to Marcus, her voice steady. We don't stop. No matter what it takes. Marcus's eyes met hers, and he nodded. The station buzzed around them, but Danielle stayed rooted in place, her mind already moving 3 steps ahead. Darren had thought he could bury the truth, but all he'd done was leave her the map to uncover it all. And she wasn't about to let it stay hidden. Danielle stood at the edge of the tech room, the faint hum of servers buzzing in her ears as Marcus scrolled through the files pulled from Darren's flash drive. The dim light from the monitor cast sharp shadows across their faces, highlighting the tension that had settled thick between them. Danielle's fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the desk as she tried to process what she was looking at. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was explosive. Marcus's voice broke the silence. These bank transfers, they don't just stop with Darren. He zoomed in on a series of payments, tracing them through shell companies and offshore accounts. This money, it connects directly to 2 city council members. And look at this one here. That's the mayor's chief of staff. Danielle's stomach churned. And the others? Marcus hesitated, clicking through more folders. 4 judges. 3 prosecutors. And 2 more officers in this station. Danielle's pulse quickened. Who? Marcus turned to face her, his voice low. Henderson and Alvarez. Danielle exhaled sharply, stepping back. Henderson had been with the department for 20 years, an officer everyone trusted, or so it seemed. Alvarez had been newer but well-liked, the kind of cop who always volunteered for community outreach programs. She felt her chest tighten. We need to bring them in, Marcus said. Danielle shook her head. Not yet. If we move too fast, we'll lose them. They'll run. Marcus frowned. And if we wait too long? Danielle's voice was firm. We don't wait long. But we do this smart. Before Marcus could respond, a knock at the door made them both turn. An internal affairs agent stepped in, her face tense. We have a problem, she said. Danielle straightened. What kind of problem? The agent glanced at Marcus before answering. Darren. He's asking for a deal. Danielle's eyes narrowed. A deal? The agent nodded. He says he has more names, bigger names, but he won't talk unless we cut him a deal first. Marcus's jaw tightened. Of course he does. He's trying to save himself. Danielle's voice was sharp. No. He's trying to buy time. Marcus turned to her. So what do we do? Danielle's eyes didn't leave the agent. We hear him out. But not on his terms. The interrogation room felt colder than the last time she'd been inside it. Darren sat on the other side of the table, his wrists cuffed and his expression guarded, but the flicker of desperation in his eyes gave him away. He looked up as Danielle entered, and for the first time, there was no smirk, just a man trying to hold on to whatever scraps of control he had left. You wanted to talk, Danielle said, sitting down across from him. Darren leaned forward, his cuffs clinking against the table. You need me. Danielle didn't blink. You need me more. Darren's jaw tensed. You don't know what you're up against. Then enlighten me. Darren hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the mirror on the wall. Not here. Danielle crossed her arms. You don't get to make demands. You don't get it, Darren snapped. This doesn't stop with me. You think taking me down is the end? It's not. The people I worked for, they'll come after you. They'll come after your family. Do you have any idea what they're capable of? Danielle's voice didn't waver. I know exactly what they're capable of. And I'm not scared of them. Darren leaned back, his lips curling into something that almost looked like a smile. You should be. Danielle leaned forward. Give me the names. Darren's smile faded. Not without a deal. Danielle stared at him for a long moment before pushing back from the table. You're out of leverage, Darren. He flinched. You think they'll protect you, she continued. You think the people you're covering for are going to stick their necks out for you now? You're a loose end, and you know it. So here's how this is going to work, you tell me what I need to know, or I make sure you take the fall for every single thing on that drive. Darren's face hardened, but the crack in his confidence was visible now. Danielle stood. Take your time. But not too much. As she left the room, Marcus was waiting outside. Well? He asked. He's breaking, Danielle said. Marcus's eyes narrowed. But will he talk? Danielle's voice was steady. He will. Hours later, Danielle stood in her office, staring out the window as the city lights blinked in the distance. The station had quieted, but her mind hadn't. The pieces were coming together, but every new connection felt like pulling at a thread that threatened to unravel the entire system. A knock at the door pulled her back. Marcus stepped in, his face tense. He talked, he said. Danielle turned, her heart pounding. And? Marcus handed her a sheet of paper. It's worse than we thought. Danielle scanned the names, judges, attorneys, politicians. Each one felt heavier than the last. What now? Marcus asked. Danielle set the paper down and looked up at him. We keep going. Marcus hesitated. Danielle, this could blow up everything. Danielle's voice was quiet but firm. It already has. As Marcus left, Danielle leaned back against her desk, her fingers tightening around the edges. Darren had cracked, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because the people at the top, the ones who had built this web of corruption, weren't going to let it fall without a fight. And Danielle Brooks wasn't going to let them win. Danielle stood in the dimly lit break room, the hum of the vending machines the only sound filling the space. She didn't sit. Instead, she leaned against the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as Marcus entered, closing the door behind him. His face was pale, his shoulders tense. He held a stack of papers in one hand and his phone in the other. You're not going to like this, Marcus said, setting the papers down on the small, cluttered table. Danielle didn't move. What now? Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes darting to her before he finally exhaled. One of the names Darren gave us. Judge Hawkins. He's already gone. Resigned this morning. No press, no announcement, just gone. Danielle's jaw tightened. He's running. Looks like it. Marcus nodded. But that's not all. Danielle's stomach sank. Tell me. Marcus slid his phone across the counter. On the screen was an email, anonymous, untraceable, but the words punched like a fist. Back off, or the next body will be yours. Danielle's eyes stayed fixed on the screen, her pulse quickening, but she didn't flinch. Marcus leaned closer. They're getting desperate. Danielle pushed the phone away. Good. That means we're getting close. Marcus stepped back, his voice sharp. Danielle, this isn't a game. These people aren't just powerful, they're dangerous. If we keep pushing, she cut him off. Then we keep pushing harder. Marcus's frustration boiled over. You think this ends with an arrest? With headlines? It doesn't. These people don't stop. You need to think about what happens if this spirals out of control. Danielle's voice was steady, but her eyes burned. It's already out of control, Marcus. You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel it every second I'm in this building? I can't undo what's already started. And I wouldn't even if I could. Marcus ran a hand through his hair. What if you're wrong? What if you're walking us into something we can't walk out of? Danielle stepped closer. Then I'll walk through it alone if I have to. Marcus stared at her, his jaw tightening. You don't have to. She softened, just slightly. Then stay with me. But don't try to stop me. Before Marcus could respond, the door creaked open and one of the internal affairs agents stepped inside, her expression grim. "We need you both," she said. "Now." Danielle and Marcus exchanged a look before following her down the hall. The station had grown quieter, but the tension hung heavier, like everyone was holding their breath. They entered the tech room, where two analysts hovered over a monitor. One of them looked up as Danielle stepped closer. "We finished decrypting the last files from the drive," the analyst said. "And we found this." The screen flickered, and a video loaded. It was shaky, the kind of footage you'd expect from a hidden camera. But the audio was clear. Darren's voice came first. "It's done. She won't find anything." A second voice followed. Deeper. Colder. "She better not. Because if this falls apart, it's not just you that's going down." Danielle's stomach clenched. "Who is that?" The analyst hesitated. "We ran the voiceprint. It's Councilman Bradley." Marcus swore under his breath, but Danielle's focus didn't waver. She stepped closer to the screen, watching as the video continued. "What about the money?" Darren asked. "Already moved," Bradley said. "And the witnesses?" "Handled." The video cut out, leaving the room in silence. Marcus turned to Danielle. "That's enough to bury him." Danielle shook her head. "Not yet. We need him alive. If we go after him now, he'll pull everyone else down with him." Marcus frowned. "And if we wait?" Danielle's voice was sharp. "We don't wait long. But we make sure we hit them all at once." The room buzzed with tension as Marcus stepped back. "You really think he's going to let us get that far?" Danielle didn't hesitate. "He won't have a choice." But the weight of her words hung heavy as the team dispersed. Danielle lingered, her eyes fixed on the screen long after the video had ended. Marcus returned a few minutes later, his voice quieter now. "There's something else. Brent's asking to speak with you." Danielle exhaled. "Bring him in." Minutes later, Brent sat across from her, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed them together. "You said you wanted to make this right," Danielle said. "Now's your chance." Brent nodded, but his voice wavered. "They're watching me." "I know they are." Danielle's eyes didn't leave his. "Then we need to move faster." Brent swallowed. "You don't get it. If you think Darren was bad, these people. They'll do whatever it takes." "Whatever it takes." Danielle leaned in. "So will I." Brent blinked, startled by the force in her voice. "What if it's not enough?" Danielle's voice dropped. "Then we keep pushing until it is." Brent hesitated, but then he started talking. Details poured out, names, meetings, locations, each word adding more weight to the case they were building. By the time he finished, Danielle felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. Marcus stepped closer. "We've got enough to move on Bradley." Danielle nodded, but her mind was already racing. They had come this far, but the next step wasn't just a move, it was the moment everything either came together or fell apart. She turned to Marcus. "Get the team ready." Marcus hesitated. "Danielle," she looked at him, her voice steady. "No more warnings. No more waiting." Marcus nodded, but Danielle could see the worry in his eyes. As she left the room, her footsteps echoed through the hall. The station felt heavier now, the tension suffocating. She could feel it building, pressing down on her chest with every step. But she didn't stop. Because this wasn't just about Darren anymore. This was bigger, darker, and she wasn't going to let it stay buried. No matter what it cost. Danielle stood at the edge of the courtroom, her heart steady as the verdict was read. The room was packed, reporters, officers, city officials, all leaning forward, waiting for the final word. Darren sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor stripped away. His shoulders sagged, his face pale, and his eyes darted nervously as though he still believed he could find a way out. But there was no escape this time. The judge's voice rang out. Guilty. The word hung in the air, echoing like a gunshot. Darren's head dropped, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The courtroom erupted, murmurs and gasps filling the space, but Danielle didn't move. She stayed rooted in place, her gaze fixed on Darren as the reality of his downfall settled over him. He turned toward her then, his eyes filled with something she hadn't expected, fear. For the first time, he looked small. Powerless. And maybe, just for a moment, he understood what it felt like to be on the other side of authority. But Danielle didn't flinch. She held his gaze until he looked away. Outside the courtroom, the air was thick with reporters shouting questions. Danielle pushed through the crowd, her head held high, Marcus by her side. You did it, Marcus said, his voice low but filled with relief. Danielle didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced back toward the building, where Darren was being led out in cuffs. We did it, she corrected. Marcus gave her a tight smile. You know this isn't over. Danielle nodded. It's never over. The investigation had unraveled more than she had anticipated. Darren's arrest had been the beginning, but the fallout had been swift. Judge Hawkins had been indicted. Councilman Bradley was facing federal charges, along with the mayor's chief of staff. Henderson and Alvarez had turned themselves in, cutting deals to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. And Brent had handed over everything. He was cooperating, but his career was over. He had taken a plea deal, and Danielle had made sure it included mandatory counseling and community service. She had stood in front of the press the night his deal was announced, making it clear that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. But there were others, names they hadn't uncovered yet, connections still buried under layers of secrecy. Danielle knew the fight wasn't finished, but for the first time, she felt like they had taken back control. Later that night, Danielle stood outside the station, staring up at the building she had fought so hard to change. Marcus joined her, leaning against the railing. You could leave, you know, he said. After this, you could take another job. Start fresh somewhere else. Danielle shook her head. I'm not running. Marcus studied her. You're not afraid. Danielle's lips curved into a faint smile. I'm always afraid. But fear doesn't win unless you let it. Marcus nodded, but his expression softened. You were right, you know. About everything. Danielle looked at him. Not about everything. I didn't think it would go this far. But I should have. Marcus exhaled, leaning back. And now? Danielle's voice was steady. Now, we make sure it doesn't happen again. The night felt heavy, but there was something else in the air, something lighter. Possibility. Danielle turned back toward the station, her steps firm as she walked inside. She wasn't done yet. She didn't know if she ever would be. But for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Reflection and engagement. This story isn't just about corruption or power, it's about what happens when we let fear keep us silent. It's about the cost of doing nothing, the weight of turning a blind eye, and the courage it takes to stand up and say, enough. Danielle's story reminds us that justice doesn't come easily. It comes with sacrifice, determination, and sometimes even fear. But it also shows us that no matter how powerful the opposition may seem, the truth has a way of coming out. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed something unfair or unjust and wondered if you should speak up? What stopped you, or what pushed you to take action? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about accountability, courage, and the kind of change we all want to see. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Tales of Twist, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another gripping story like this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.